For most of the last 200 years, the story told about the Amazon rainforest went something like this. It was too hostile, too poor in soil, too dense to ever have supported anything more than small, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers drifting through an untouched wilderness. Empires happened in the Andes, cities happened on the coast. The rainforest itself was simply too much nature and not enough civilization. That story is now dead, and it died specifically because of a technology that lets you erase an entire forest without cutting down a single tree. Over the past several years, teams of archaeologists working across Ecuador, Bolivia, and Brazil have flown lasers over the Amazon canopy, digitally stripped away millions of trees, and found something underneath that shouldn't have been there according to a century of scientific consensus. Roads. Plazas, pyramids, canals stretching for kilometers. Entire cities, some of them older than the Roman Empire, quietly buried under jungle that everyone assumed had always been empty. The technology behind all of this is called LiDAR, short for light detection and ranging, and the basic principle is almost embarrassingly simple once you understand it. An aircraft, helicopter, or drone flies over the target area carrying a scanner that fires hundreds of thousands, sometimes over 1 million, pulses of laser light down at the ground every second. Most of those pulses hit leaves, branches, and canopy on the way down and bounce straight back. But a small fraction slip through gaps in the vegetation all the way to the forest floor and bounce back from there instead. Because the system precisely times how long each pulse takes to return, it can calculate the exact distance to whatever it hit. Multiply that by 1 million pulses a second across a survey area, and you end up with an enormous cloud of individual distance measurements, dense enough that software can statistically separate the points that bounced off leaves and branches from the much smaller set that made it all the way to bare Earth. Strip out everything except that second group, and what's left is a bare three-dimensional model of the actual ground surface, as if the entire forest canopy had simply been switched off. The concept isn't new. LiDAR has existed in some form for around 6 decades, and its use in archaeology dates back further than the recent wave of headlines might suggest. What's changed is accessibility. Sensors have gotten smaller, lighter, and dramatically cheaper, to the point where systems that once required a dedicated aircraft and a research budget in the millions can now be mounted on a drone. Pulse density, essentially the resolution of the resulting map, has improved sharply as well, which matters enormously in dense tropical forest, where even a small fraction of laser pulses reaching the ground can be enough to reconstruct fine architectural detail as long as there are enough of them. For archaeologists working in the Amazon specifically, that combination has been transformative in a way that's hard to overstate. Ground survey in tropical rainforest is brutally slow and physically punishing, often requiring teams to hack through dense vegetation for weeks just to map a few square kilometers. And even then, earthworks and structures that have been buried under soil and root systems for centuries are easy to walk right past without ever noticing them. A single LiDAR flight can cover the same ground in hours and reveal patterns that would be completely invisible from the forest floor, no matter how carefully someone was looking. The discovery that arguably kicked off the current wave of attention came out of Ecuador's Upano Valley, in the eastern foothills of the Andes, published in the journal Science in early 2024 by a team led by archaeologist Stephen Rostaing of France's National Center for Scientific Research, working with colleague Antoine Dorison. Rostaing had actually been excavating in the Upano Valley for around 25 years before the LiDAR survey, aware that scattered earth and mounds existed in the area, but with no real way to see how they connected across the landscape as a whole. The LiDAR scan changed that instantly. It revealed more than 6,000 rectangular earthen platforms arranged around plazas and connected by an extensive network of straight roads and footpaths spread across roughly 230 square miles of what had, until that moment, looked from ground level like unbroken forest. The scale of what emerged surprised even researchers who had spent decades expecting something significant to be down there. Rather than isolated villages, the LiDAR data revealed an interconnected system of larger urban centers and smaller satellite towns, complete with monumental architecture, agricultural terracing carved into hillsides, and water management infrastructure including canals and causeways engineered to move water intentionally across the landscape. One of the largest settlements, given the name Kungants, showed complexes of rectangular platforms arranged around low squares, threaded together by wide dug streets running through what had clearly once been a planned neighborhood, not an organic sprawl. Radiocarbon dating placed occupation of the site at somewhere between roughly 2,000 and 3,000 years old, which puts the founding of these settlements comfortably before the rise of the Roman Empire. Built and inhabited by cultures researchers now refer to as the Quilimopé and Upano peoples, with later occupation by a group called the Huapula. Estimates suggest the valley was home to at least 10,000 farmers at its height, organized into a genuinely complex urban system rather than a loose scatter of subsistence settlements. Rostaing has been characteristically direct about what it felt like to actually see the LiDAR data resolve into a city for the first time, describing the reaction in the room as simple astonishment, the kind of response that comes from having a landscape you thought you already understood turn out to contain something you'd spent decades walking directly over without ever fully seeing. Co-author Antoine Dorison has pointed out that this discovery forces a fairly complete rethink of the assumptions most people carry about early Amazonian life. The default mental image of small, loosely organized groups living lightly on the land simply doesn't match a society that built and maintained thousands of earthen platforms, engineered water systems, and a coordinated road network across more than 200 square miles. While Rostain's team was mapping Ecuador, a separate research group working further south in the Llanos de Mojos region of Bolivia was uncovering something that looked architecturally quite different but pointed toward the same broader conclusion. The Llanos de Mojos is a vast, seasonally flooded savanna covering roughly 120,000 square kilometers, an area comparable in size to England sitting along the southwestern edge of the Amazon basin. Archaeologists, Heiko Prumers of the German Archaeological Institute and Carla Jaimes Betancourt of the University of Bonn had been excavating earthen mounds in the region for more than 2 decades before their team, working with colleagues from the University of Exeter, deployed helicopter-mounted LiDAR across 6 separate survey areas in 2019. What emerged was evidence of the Casarabe culture, which flourished across roughly 4,500 square kilometers of the region between around 500 and 1400 CE. The LiDAR data revealed 26 distinct settlement sites organized into a clear 4-tiered hierarchy, with 2 remarkably large central settlements, one covering approximately 147 hectares and the other around 315, each surrounded by concentric polygonal earthen banks and functioning as hubs for a network of smaller satellite communities. The civic and ceremonial architecture at these central sites included stepped platforms topped with U-shaped structures, rectangular platform mounds, and conical pyramids reaching as high as 22 meters, genuinely monumental construction by any standard. Connecting all of this together was an engineered landscape on a scale that surprised even researchers who had spent years anticipating something significant. Raised causeways, straight as a ruled line in places, stretched for kilometers between settlements. An extensive system of canals and reservoirs managed water across a landscape that floods seasonally, transforming what would otherwise be an agriculturally difficult waterlogged savanna into productive farmland and fishing grounds. Prumers described the resulting pattern as a form of low-density urbanism, cities that spread their population and infrastructure across a much wider area than a typical dense city center, rather than clustering tightly the way most people picture urban settlement. It's a pattern that had previously been documented in parts of Southeast Asia and Central America, but never before at this scale in the Amazon lowlands specifically. The comparison researchers involved in the project reached for wasn't a small provincial outpost. They described the scale, the monumental architecture, the water management engineering, and the sheer spatial extent of settlement dispersal as comparable to sophisticated Andean cultures, a striking claim for a region that had spent most of the 20th century being treated as archaeologically marginal at best. There's also a more urgent, less celebratory note running through this particular discovery. Betancourt has pointed out that the same modernization currently transforming the Llanos de Mojos, specifically the expansion of mechanized agriculture, is actively destroying pre-Columbian earthworks, canals, and causeways on essentially a monthly basis. In that context, LiDAR isn't just a discovery tool. It's functioning as an emergency documentation effort, racing to map and record structures before agricultural machinery erases them permanently, in some cases, before archaeologists even have the chance to study them on the ground. Ecuador and Bolivia represent 2 specific, intensively studied regions, but a separate, more recent line of research has attempted something considerably more ambitious, estimating how many similar earthworks might exist across the entire Amazon basin, most of which has never been surveyed with LiDAR at all. Vinicius Perepado, an analyst at Brazil's National Institute for Space Research, led a team that combined existing LiDAR coverage, still a small fraction of the total forest, with statistical modeling to extrapolate how many undiscovered pre-Columbian earthworks might be distributed across the wider basin. The resulting estimate is striking on its own terms. Somewhere between 10,000 and 24,000 earthworks likely exist throughout the Amazon, the overwhelming majority of them never directly surveyed, let alone excavated. That figure comes with an important caveat that Perepado and his collaborators have been careful to flag themselves. A statistical extrapolation from a small sample of scanned terrain to the entire basin is not the same thing as physically confirming 10,000 individual sites. Each specific location predicted by the model still needs ground verification before researchers can say with confidence what's actually there. And that verification process, given the sheer physical difficulty of accessing much of the Amazon interior, will likely take decades, even under optimistic funding and access scenarios. What the estimate does establish fairly convincingly, though, is scale. Even accounting for substantial uncertainty in the model, the pattern emerging from Ecuador and Bolivia isn't a pair of isolated anomalies. It's consistent with a genuinely widespread phenomenon, pre-Columbian societies modifying and building across the Amazon landscape on a scale that current archaeological knowledge has barely begun to catalog. Parapato has noted that the implications of this work have already started influencing fields well beyond archaeology, since researchers studying present-day forest ecology are now using the same earthwork data to help distinguish between naturally occurring vegetation patterns and forest composition that was actually shaped, sometimes deliberately cultivated by human activity centuries ago. To understand why these findings have generated as much attention as they have within archaeology, it helps to understand exactly what assumption they're overturning, and how deeply embedded that assumption had become. For most of the 20th century, the dominant scientific view held that the Amazon soils were simply too poor, too acidic, and too nutrient depleted to support the kind of large-scale, settled agriculture that dense populations require. Under that framework, the rainforest's biodiversity and apparent wildness were treated as evidence of an essentially untouched landscape, one where any human presence would have been necessarily light, temporary, and small in scale. That view shaped not just archaeology, but conservation policy, popular media, and school curricula for generations, reinforcing an image of the Amazon as pristine wilderness rather than a landscape with a deep, complex human history layered into it. The LiDAR findings from the past several years don't just add a few data points to that picture, they directly contradict its central premise. Building thousands of earthen platforms, engineering canal networks across a flood-prone savanna, and maintaining coordinated road systems across hundreds of square miles requires exactly the kind of stable, large-scale agricultural surplus and organized labor that the old model insisted the Amazon couldn't produce. These weren't temporary camps. Radiocarbon dating at multiple sites shows continuous or repeated occupation across centuries, in some cases well over 1,000 years, requiring generation after generation of sustained agricultural management rather than a single opportunistic settlement. Researchers involved in this work have started pushing back specifically against the idea of a single, unified Amazonian culture, preferring instead to describe a genuinely diverse patchwork of distinct societies, each with its own architectural style, economic base, and form of governance that happen to share the same broad ecological setting. The Upano cultures of Ecuador and the Casarabe culture of Bolivia look architecturally quite different from each other, which is itself evidence against treating the pre-Columbian Amazon as a single, monolithic society. Rostaine has specifically argued that the more accurate framing isn't Amazonia in the singular, but something closer to Amazonias, plural, reflecting just how much cultural variation existed across a landscape too often treated as archaeologically uniform simply because it was hard to see into. It's worth stepping back to appreciate just how long these sites sat essentially invisible, not because nobody was looking, but because the tools available simply weren't capable of seeing through the one obstacle standing in the way of every single one of them, the forest itself. Conventional aerial photography, the workhorse of archaeological survey for most of the 20th century, is fundamentally limited by the same problem ground survey faces, just from a different angle. A camera captures whatever reflects visible light back at it, and in a closed canopy rainforest that's almost entirely leaves. Even satellite imagery, however high its resolution, runs into the same wall. You can photograph the Amazon in exhaustive detail from orbit, and still see nothing but a uniform green ceiling stretching to the horizon, with whatever lies beneath it completely concealed. Archaeologists working in the region before LiDAR became practical were essentially limited to two options, both painfully slow. The first was ground survey, physically walking transects through dense vegetation, sometimes with a machete in hand, hoping to stumble across a mound, a ditch, or an unnatural rise in the terrain. The second was excavation at sites already known through local knowledge, oral history, or earlier partial surveys, working outward from a confirmed starting point rather than searching blind. Both methods worked and both produced real archaeological knowledge over the decades, but both were also inherently limited to covering tiny fractions of the total landscape. And both were prone to missing structures entirely if they happened to be subtle, degraded, or simply off the path. A survey team happened to walk. LiDAR sidesteps that entire problem by changing what it measures. Instead of capturing reflected light in the visible spectrum, which vegetation blocks almost completely, it captures the return time of infrared laser pulses, a small but statistically reliable fraction of which make it through even dense canopy gaps all the way to bare ground. Run enough pulses, and you get enough ground returns to reconstruct the terrain surface in meaningful detail, effectively giving researchers the ability to survey the same ground a walking team would cover in months, except from the air, in a single flight, without ever needing to physically set foot on the site until after the map already exists. That shift matters enormously for how discoveries actually happen now. Rostain's 25 years of ground excavation in the Upano Valley gave him detailed, valuable knowledge of individual mounds and structures he'd personally worked on. But it took a single LiDAR flight to reveal how those isolated features actually connected into a coherent urban network spanning hundreds of square miles, a pattern that would have been essentially impossible to piece together from ground level alone, no matter how many additional decades of walking survey had been invested. Once LiDAR started delivering results in one part of the Amazon, the natural next question for researchers became whether what they were seeing was a local anomaly or a hint of something much larger, and that question is precisely what's been driving the field's rapid expansion over the past several years. Prior to the current wave of LiDAR-driven discovery, most well-documented evidence of large-scale pre-Columbian Amazonian societies came from a relatively small number of specific, already known regions, including earlier work on raised field agriculture and settlement mounds in parts of southern Amazonia that had been identified well before LiDAR became widely accessible. Those earlier findings were genuinely significant in their own right, and they had already started chipping away at the old assumption of a sparsely populated Amazon well before Ecuador and Bolivia made international headlines. But they were also treated for years as somewhat exceptional cases, impressive but geographically limited examples rather than evidence of a widespread pattern. What's changed is the accumulation of independent, geographically separated discoveries, all pointing toward the same broad conclusion using the same technology. Ecuador's Upano Valley and Bolivia's Llanos de Mojos sit hundreds of kilometers apart, occupied by culturally distinct societies with different architectural traditions, different construction timelines, and different approaches to managing their local landscape. The fact that both regions, surveyed independently by separate research teams using the same underlying LiDAR method, turned up large-scale, engineered, long-occupied settlements, is a considerably stronger form of evidence than either discovery would have been in isolation. It suggests the pattern isn't a quirk of one unusually fertile valley or one unusually resourceful culture, but something closer to a recurring feature of how pre-Columbian societies across a much wider swath of the Amazon basin organized themselves whenever local conditions allowed for it. That's precisely the logic behind Parapato's basin-wide extrapolation. If two geographically separate, culturally distinct regions both turn out to contain substantial, previously unknown settlement systems, once properly surveyed, the statistically reasonable expectation isn't that those two regions happen to be the only ones. It's that similar systems likely exist in comparable, still unsurveyed terrain elsewhere across the basin, in numbers that could run into the tens of thousands once ground-truthed. The specific estimate of 10 to 24,000 earthworks is, in that sense, less a wild guess, and more the direct statistical consequence of finding real evidence in more than one place using the same reliable method. It's worth being direct about how much remains genuinely uncertain, because the excitement around these discoveries has sometimes outpaced what the evidence can actually support at this stage. LiDAR reveals shape, not substance. A scan can show the outline of a platform, a plaza, or a road with impressive precision, but it can't by itself tell researchers who lived there, what they grew, how their society was organized politically, or why a given settlement was eventually abandoned. That information has to come from old-fashioned, on-the-ground archaeology, excavation, radiocarbon dating of organic material, analysis of pottery and tools, and careful stratigraphic work, all of which take vastly longer than a single LiDAR flight and require physical access to sites that are often difficult to reach. Researchers working on both the Ecuador and Bolivia projects have been explicit that LiDAR functions as a starting point rather than a conclusion. Rostain's team has been following up their initial survey with radiocarbon dating work to pin down occupation timelines more precisely. Other researchers working on separate Mesoamerican LiDAR discoveries have described plans to return to specific sites with additional tools, including magnetometers and ground-penetrating radar, to build a fuller picture beneath the surface features a laser scan alone can detect. That layered, multi-technology approach, LiDAR first defined the shape of what's there, then targeted ground survey to understand what it actually was, has become the standard workflow across this entire wave of research. Population estimates in particular remain genuinely contested. Knowing that 10,000 farmers likely lived in the Upano Valley, or that a Casarabe settlement controlled roughly 500 square kilometers of surrounding territory, is a meaningfully different claim than knowing exactly how large the total population across the wider region was at its peak, how trade moved between distant settlements, or how political authority was actually organized and exercised. Those questions remain open, and closing them will require years of additional fieldwork that LiDAR alone cannot provide, however good it is at revealing where to look. The implications of this research reach further than rewriting a chapter in an archaeology textbook, and researchers across several fields have started treating these findings as directly relevant to their own work. Ecologists studying the modern Amazon's biodiversity have increasingly had to reckon with the possibility that patterns they once assumed were purely natural certain concentrations of useful fruit trees, particular patterns of forest composition, may actually reflect centuries of deliberate human cultivation and management, rather than untouched wilderness. Researchers have documented that so-called domesticated tree species, useful plants that pre-Columbian societies selectively favored, transplanted, or actively cultivated over generations, remain measurably overrepresented in parts of the Amazon today, centuries after the societies that shaped that distribution largely disappeared. If large populations were actively shaping the forest for 1,000 years or more before European contact, then understanding the Amazon's current ecology accurately may require factoring in that human history rather than treating the forest as a purely natural baseline, a shift that touches everything from biodiversity, conservation planning, to carbon storage modeling used in climate research. There's also a conservation and climate dimension that researchers have started raising directly. Evidence that dense, organized human societies once lived sustainably within Amazon ecosystems for centuries, engineering agricultural and water systems that worked with the landscape's seasonal flooding rather than fighting it, offers a genuinely different model for how large populations might coexist with tropical forest long term, one that doesn't necessarily require the kind of large-scale clearing associated with modern agricultural expansion in the region. That's a meaningfully different starting point for policy conversations than the older assumption that any substantial human population in the Amazon would necessarily come at the forest's expense. And there's an unavoidable urgency to all of this. The same LiDAR technology that's revealing these sites is also documenting, in real time, how quickly modern land use change is erasing them. Betancourt's warning about mechanized agriculture destroying Casarabe infrastructure on a monthly basis in Bolivia isn't an isolated concern specific to one region. Deforestation, agricultural expansion, and infrastructure development are proceeding across the Amazon basin considerably faster than archaeological survey and excavation ever could, which means a meaningful fraction of what Parapato's model predicts exists out there, somewhere between 10,000 and 24,000 undiscovered earthworks, may simply be destroyed before anyone gets the chance to confirm it was ever there at all. In that sense, every LiDAR survey flown today is doing two things simultaneously: expanding what's known about the pre-Columbian Amazon, and racing against a clock that's ticking considerably faster than the pace of archaeological funding and fieldwork typically allows. What LiDAR has ultimately revealed isn't a handful of isolated ruins scattered across an otherwise untouched wilderness. It's a pattern repeating across multiple countries, multiple cultures, and multiple centuries of large, organized, agriculturally sophisticated societies that lived across the Amazon for well over 1,000 years, built genuinely monumental infrastructure, and then largely vanished from both the historical and popular record, hidden by exactly the forest canopy that made them so difficult to find in the first place. It's worth pausing on that disappearance too, since it raises its own set of open questions researchers are still working through. Occupation at both the Upano sites and the Casarabe settlements appears to have ended well before large-scale European contact reshaped the continent, which rules out colonization itself as the direct cause in either case. Researchers have pointed to a range of possible contributing factors across different Amazonian societies more broadly, including long-term climate shifts affecting the seasonal flooding patterns these engineered water systems depended on, gradual soil depletion after centuries of intensive cultivation, and internal political or social change, reshaping how these societies organize themselves over time. None of those explanations are fully settled for either the Upano or Casarabe cases specifically, and pinning down what actually happened at each individual site will likely require years of additional excavation, environmental sampling, and dating work layered on top of what the LiDAR surveys have already revealed. The technology that found these societies in the first place is still, in archaeological terms, in its early days. Only a small fraction of the Amazon basin has actually been scanned. Every new survey so far has turned up something researchers didn't fully expect. And the current statistical estimates suggest the vast majority of what's out there hasn't been found yet at all. The forest that generations of scientists once described as empty is turning out to be one of the largest unexplored archaeological records left on the planet, sitting quietly under the canopy, waiting for the next aircraft to fly over and switch the trees off. What began as a purely technical exercise, mapping terrain with laser pulses instead of footsteps, has ended up doing something considerably larger, forcing a genuine rewrite of how an entire continent's history gets told. The Amazon wasn't a passive backdrop that history happened around. For well over 1,000 years in multiple places at once, it was where history was actively being built, one earthen platform, one engineered canal, one carefully planned road at a time, entirely out of sight of everyone looking for it in the wrong way.